Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I'm really excited to be running very soon, this Monday, in fact, Monday the 3rd, I think it is, day before 4th of July, a session of All for One Regime Diabolique with our 4 Game Master Lights in Darkness campaign. But I tell you what, it's an awful lot of work. Not so much that I have to do a ton of work for the session, it's like a 3-hour one-shot, more or less. So I just have to have enough material in there to cover that sort of thing. Could last an hour, could last 4 hours, who knows? Depends on, you know, what they do. But I've got this little scenario, and either you're going to go through it or completely turn it on its head, which I hope they do, because that's a lot of fun. Really, what's made it a lot of work is as I have to not only make sure I'm pretty much in line with the canon in All for One, um, and I have to keep in mind what's really going on in 17th century France around that time. Not that we're completely beholden to that, because it is 17th century France with a twist. I mean, there's vampires and werewolves already, and if we throw in something a little anachronistic or make some historical figure do something that they didn't do, that's okay. But just try to keep it, most of the stuff within bounds or accurate. But I also have to take into account what's been laid down already by the other three game masters. So what Runeslinger, what Nolan Inquisitor, what JDRD30 have put down as sort of like canon in the game. They've introduced characters, not only from characters from the book and from history, but other characters. So fortunately, we have this OneNote document which has tons and tons of information in it already. But as I'm putting this together and wanting to like add some threads from what they've put down already and add my own stuff, it's just a lot of referencing. So I've probably done more work in preparing this one session than I have in a long time in a game. And it's just to make sure that I have my ducks in a row, because not only do I have to check with what Paul Wiggy Wade Williams has said or what Will and Ariel Durant have written down, but also what Anthony and Sebastian and Francois have laid down before me. So it's a good exercise, but man, it's a lot of fact checking when it comes down to it. More work than I thought it was going to be. I'm pumped. I'm not complaining, but it's been some work. This video has nothing to do with that. I watched a couple of really fun and exciting videos by Dark Age of Roleplay Games and also by Tef's Tavern by Big Mike. And so Jason and Big Mike were talking about a subject that's become really near and dear to my heart. I sent them links to a couple of my videos where I've talked about this already and said we really should chat about this some more. And that's narration, or extending narrative control over the results of an action into the domain of the player. And how to do that, what that feels like, all that kind of stuff. Because if you watch my channel, that's something I've talked about as being, newer to me, because I played in games or game styles where pretty much the narrative control over the results generally was in the locus of control of the game master. At least that's the culture of play I grew up with. I was comfortable with it. I was fine with it. It worked just fine. But exploring this other style of play. And it's funny because as they're talking about it, they're talking about games that don't necessarily, I don't want to say support, but the first thing that something like basic fantasy role-playing game or 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, doesn't do necessarily is say, okay, well, you narrate your success as a player. You can do it. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's some. It's a very convoluted topic. It's multifaceted. There's a lot of layers. There's a lot of things to consider, I think, when it comes right down to it. So I just want to talk a little bit about that, and I'm not going to cover everything about it, because I'm not an expert and because there's an awful lot to cover, but it's just a really interesting topic, and I hope to generate a dialogue with them and hopefully with other people about this as well. Some of the things I've noticed is there's times when it's plain old supported by the system in terms of narrating your success as a player. A game like this, it doesn't say you can't, but it's not necessarily supported by the system that you're going to narrate success or narrate failure, narrate the results of, whatever you say as a player, what you would like to happen as a player, period. You can, state what your intention is going to be, and you can state your intention really simply, like, I'd like to get out of this bar because I know we're in big trouble. Or you can narrate this big giant thing, well, here's what I want to happen. I'm going to jump up on top of the bar, run across the bar, leap into the crowd, bonk this guy in the head with a bottle and steal the purse from this other person that, that has something I want in it, and then, catapult, tumble around, roll, and smash out the window. That's what I'm going to do, or that's what I do. And, we can handle that in different ways. Anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself here, which I will talk about getting ahead of yourself and premature imagination. So there's some systems that don't necessarily support it as much. There's other systems which support that kind of narration, things like Ubiquity. They don't necessarily require you to do it, but they support that in a large degree. Then there's systems which really expect you to narrate quite a bit as a player, like 7th Sea First Edition. But there are some systems that are just plain old neutral to it. And normally, I've had these talks before with Runeslinger and other people where, and it's been in my experience, this is absolutely true, regardless of culture of play. The game master tends to narrate um, when the player can't or won't. You know, there's more variables to consider, and often it's a dialogue. And I've certainly had very creative narrative players where I had no problem as they narrated at length what happened. And I've had other players that really, if you got like, I try to hit it with my sword, that was a big sentence for them. But some of the things to consider, like the timing of the narration and rolls, in terms of like at some point you're going to state your intention, you're going to roll dice. When do you narrate what actually happens? And a lot of times we run into things like premature imagination. It depends on the system. Like how does the system, what does it support? A game like 7th Sea First Edition, I haven't played it yet, but I've watched Seb's videos, I've talked with him about it, I've read the game, and it very much supports the idea of narrating the effects. You can simply go for what would be a safe roll and say, I want to, hit this person with my sword, or you can go for this big giant bunch of effects. You can essentially do what's called raises in the system. You want to know how that works, go watch his videos on 7th Sea, they're great. But you give yourself a much greater difficulty for that roll. But should you make the roll, these wonderful and nifty and incredibly cinematic events happen, but you narrate them ahead of time. This is what's going to happen, and then you might succeed or fail. But that system absolutely encourages and expects you to do stuff like that. Other times, though, we get into trouble because, even I made a video quite some time ago when I was talking about the 2d6 dungeon world mechanic, I think is the video. I put that on where I ran into some people that were used to this kind of premature imagination where they kind of said what they did and what happened. And at some point, either we said, well, we need to roll dice first, or, they would do like the called shots is what it came down to. I don't know if you played, for a long time, like play games for a long time. There was a time when there really were no called shots in games. You pretty much rolled to hit, and then there was a narration of what the damage was. And sure, there was examples in like the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide where I smashed with my mace, I squashed a spider with my boot, all that kind of stuff. Or, I hit him in the head, But when it came right down to it, there were no real called shots. At some point, and I forget when this entered the Dungeons and Dragons rules, or probably in Dragon Magazine or something like that. At some point, they put a little called shot rules, and lots of games have them. Ubiquity has called shot rules when it comes right down to that. There's some great called shot, like hit location rules in there, if you want to call it. But in any of these games, you're going to take a substantial penalty. And I don't know if you play in these games when somebody says, well, I'm going to hit him in my head or shoot him in the head with this, and we'd all stop, and the game master would say, so you're making a called shot there? And then sometimes the player would back down saying, no, I'm not making a called shot, because they know at this point, well, they're at -6 to hit or whatever the heck it was. Other times, they say, heck yeah, I'm making a called shot. I'm going for broke. There are some really cool systems there. They're great accuracy talent, which you can use to circumvent that if you want to purchase the accuracy talent. But that's just neither here nor there, just cool stuff. But that's what happens a lot of times when there's premature imagination. Is there are penalties built in if you want to say this is exactly what I want to have happen. There's literally, when it comes right down to it, there's a penalty in here for those called shots. You make all those raises, it's more difficult to do this. So it's really crucial, like when you actually narrate the effects you're trying to achieve, or pretty much narrating what happens. You narrate the events before you actually roll dice. And so there's, definitely narrating your intention versus narrating the effect before the roll is a big thing to consider. Some games have a degree of success or failure built right in. Some games do not. Once again, something like Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game really doesn't have a degree of success or failure. The closest it gets to a degree of success or failure is the damage roll when you're in combat. Other than that, if you succeed at a skill, there's no margin of success when it comes right down to it. Not built into the rules anyway. If you want to do something, you're house rolling at that point. Not so in Ubiquity. There is actually a margin of success or failure. It's the number of successes you get over what you would have needed. And so at that point, it's very much up to game master and player narration what those look at. But it's pretty much simple success, great success, unbelievable success. It becomes a dialogue once again, so you can narrate. But that happens after the roll, not before the roll. In something like this, a lot of times it's going to be before the roll. As far as I understand the system, if you have those big giant rolls after, and I could be wrong, you really don't get anything. You have to kind of put your money out where your mouth is, and make raises beforehand in order to get the nifty effects. You're pretty much risking failure. But if I'm wrong, somebody will point that out to me. But that definitely can inform how you narrate things. Now here's probably one of the harder things which I probably should have put in front of this video, but but here it is in the back. Oh well. Some of the videos I sent to Jason and to Big Mike were regarding narrating things like combat in games like Basic Fantasy Role Playing Game and other OSR games. The idea is that there's in-game knowledge that your player might have. Maybe only the game master, the dungeon master, has this in-game knowledge, and this knowledge is significantly going to affect your narration of success or failure. But let's go with your narration of success. So this classic one really is the combat. So say you're fighting two guys, and there's one guy that has 6 hit points, and there's one that has 36 hit points. Now, you roll 6 hit points of damage, and you hit the first guy. Well, you can narrate that you kill him. Maybe the game master tells you, well, that kills him, so narrate how you kill him. Maybe you do 5 hit points of damage. So at this point, you kind of wound him within 1 hit point of his life. And if you watch my channel, you know that I view things like hit points as kind of like combat mojo. We're not talking about a big giant monster. We're talking about a guy. We can't take that many real telling blows before we go down. Usually most people, 1. That's about it. That'll do me. Anyhow, but you can narrate at that point. You know that you've hurt this guy significantly. Go ahead and narrate that. All right. But all you really know is you rolled 5 hit points. Now say you hit the second guy. He's got 36 hit points. You roll 5 or 6 hit points of damage. The game master is going to have to tell you that you really didn't injure him that significantly. That when it comes right down to it, you're going to narrate a scratch or him rolling with a punch. Maybe you bruise him a little bit. Maybe you got a little bit of his combat mojo. Maybe you exhausted him a little bit. But at some point before you start to narrate your success with these 5 or 6 hit points of damage, the game master is going to have to say, hey, wait a minute. By the way, before you narrate this wonderful success where you give him this big gash in his arm or stab him in his torso or whatever the heck it is you're going to say, realize this guy's really, really good and you didn't wound him that much. So in a case like that, there's going to have to be this kind of a little bit of out-of-character artificial dialogue or dialogue on top of the actual narration. So that's one of those. I should have put this in front of the video because essentially, definitely what Dark Age was talking about, and to a large extent what Tef Stavern was talking about too. They're talking about things like Dungeons and Dragons and this type of game. There's some more steps you have to take in order to narrate success as a player, especially in something like combat. So this is just one part. Maybe just touch a little bit of this whole extending narrative control into the domain of the player when it comes to narrating success in combat, narrating success in skill rolls, whatever it is you're going to do. So a lot of times it has to be more of a dialogue, depending upon the game, and the system matters. So what's your experience been?